an article that appeared in a very well-known neuroscientific journal a number of years ago that summarized the current neuroscientific understanding of the brain correlates of what is typically thought of as intelligence by the psychological and neuroscientific community, the kind of mainstream view. And the mainstream view of what intelligence is what is measured by an IQ test. That is the conventional view of what intelligence is. Yeah. So an IQ test has a number of different subcomponents, and the single number that you obtain on an IQ test represents a summary of a number of subtests, typically about 12 subtests, 6 what we call verbal and 6 nonverbal. So for example, one of the subtests is counting backwards. So if I gave you a number like 758 and asked you to count backwards by 4 and just keep counting, that's one of the kind of tasks on this test.
Solons was saying that according to that test, he will turn out to be 0.
Well, I was going to quickly add that my sense of what you mean by intelligence, Your Holiness, is so much richer than what is measured by an IQ test. And I think that some of our discomfort this morning about in thinking how to respond to your question was because I think most of us around this table would agree that what is measured by an IQ test is just a small fraction of human intelligence, and that we need to have a much more inclusive definition. And so I think that some of the discussion that you had with Jimpala about what may constitute intelligence in terms of how to skillfully respond in different situations, that's a much broader concept, which I think probably is broader than, it's definitely broader than what's measured by an IQ test, and likely involves the participation of many different parts of the brain that come together to accomplish whatever the task is at hand. But I can go through this diagram, and this is what we know, a kind of summary based on intelligence as defined by the IQ test. So the image on the left represents the areas that are colored in red are the areas of the brain that are the most genetically influenced. They're the most heritable. So
genetically inherited, not permanent, no.
And the orientation is that with that image, that's the side view of the head, and the front, which is the most left-hand part of the figure, is the frontal cortex. And one of the things that you can see is that there's a lot of red in that area, and that means that the gray matter, the cell bodies of the brain, show in that area particularly a strong genetic influence. The brain image in the middle is a brain image that contrasts the brain activity during the performance of tasks on the intelligence test compared with tasks that are not very intellectually demanding, very easy tasks. And what you can see is that one of the key areas that is activated, that's shown in red, is in that prefrontal cortex, which we keep talking about. And then finally, the last image on the right is an image that depicts the relationship between it's across individuals, and it's showing that those individuals that are more intelligent as measured by an IQ test show more activation in this prefrontal region of the brain. So the picture that we get from this indicates that at least as what's measured by an IQ test or an intelligence test, the prefrontal cortex is very, very important, and also that that is an area of the brain that's strongly genetically influenced.
So here you're referring to kind of more genetically kind of based expression of intelligence, which seem to be more inborn. Or what about, trained intelligence?
It's a very important question. This does not reflect necessarily trained intelligence. The performance on an IQ test, as we currently have an IQ test in the West, is influenced by genetics. So it shows a fairly substantial influence of genetics. That doesn't mean that it can't be influenced by training. It simply means that genetic influences are one source of influence, but training could be another source. We know that if you engage in certain kinds of training to strengthen the activity in the prefrontal cortex, you can actually change it. So, for example, you can train a person on what is called a working memory task. And a working memory task is a task such as the working memory is what is required if someone tells you a telephone number and asks you to remember that telephone number, 7 digits or 10 digits, and then you have a cup of tea, and then 5 minutes later you have to recall that, or 3 minutes later even, that telephone number. Keeping it in your mind is something that requires working memory. That's something that at least to some extent can be trained, and when you train it, it influences exactly that area of the brain, the prefrontal cortex.
전반마다 인텔리전스 말아.
Yeah, but that's more to do with memory rather than intelligence.
Yes, that's an important point. It turns out that the prefrontal cortex influences not just memory, but also aspects of intelligence.
Yeah, but Richie, I mean, isn't the idea that if you have a good working memory, you are able to recall the necessary information to act intelligently? Dirisha. 내가 그 temper도 야부요나. 디나 니주 망아 냐토고 요벤자. 니주 망아 냐 투나 안 대초게 깝다 뜸베.
Christoph wants to make a point.
Yes, we turn. Hello? Hi.
No.
No? 3, 2. Number 2.
Can someone switch on the number 2
Beep, beep.
hand? Yeah, that works. Yeah.
So it turns out that working memory is one of the best predictor of intelligence. Not long-term memory, but the ability to quickly store information and a minute later recall it turns out to be very closely correlated to IQ, which is different from long-term memory. But if I ask you, how do you get from here back home, and what is on the right side of the road when you leave, that sort of ability, this very flexible, fluid form of intelligence, that relates well to IQ, which does predict quite well outcome in life, by the way. So,
Outcome
in life. So, in the defense of the conventional IQ test, high IQ tends to predict how well you do in school, how well you do in university, whether you end up in prison. It tends to predict your income. So it certainly correlates with all those things that are outcomes of real life behaviors. It doesn't predict wisdom, probably.
So from the experience of Tibetan monastic education, we generally distinguish among individuals variability. Some individual students tend to have a very good memory capacity, so they're able to memorize extensively. Some individuals display much greater aptitude towards debate and critical, kind of discussion. And some individuals... And for example, there are some great scholars, who are very good debaters, but when it comes to memorization, they can barely manage a single stanza, 4 lines. So
야 가셔 뭐 쉬고 자자 동자 논지신 교육이
And then you have the opposite example where there are students and scholars who can memorize literally hundreds and hundreds of folios, but when it comes to debating, they're pretty hopeless. And then it's also saying that the third, there are individuals who seem to have a real aptitude for being able to have a greater comprehension, to be able to get to the point, to be able to understand things in a much more comprehensive manner.
So the social intelligence 지기니 쉬우시더라. 맨날 쉬우시.
So there seem to be many different facets to what we call intelligence.
This is exactly the
딱 공부를 해봐주시오, 소리.
And there seems to be also probably a factor of habituation as well.
Yeah. This was exactly the point I was making this morning, that there are many different forms of intelligence, and the kind of variations that you describe likely are associated with different circuits in the brain, not all the same.
If I may add something, it is very interesting what you just said. We have words for it, and we call one aspect of intelligence crystallized intelligence, and this is knowledge-based. It's people who can memorize a lot and can bring that as argument. And then we have fluid intelligence, like a river, and this is more the ability to use items and recombine them. To flexibly.
Flexible.
It's like cognitive flexibility and how much items you can use and recombine and put in a row. And that's what we call fluid intelligence. And one is mapping with the prefrontal cortex.
Which is fluid intelligence.
Which is fluid. And the memory is rather stored somewhere else, which is more the temporal lobes or hippocampus. It's necessary for memory.
This seems to be correlated to another aspect of the Buddhist kind of education theory, if you want. We speak of clear intelligence, people who have an ability to think clearly. And then, sort of heightened intelligence, people who have really very, very vast and great. So these intelligence, for example, the people who have this quite a vast capacity, they have the ability to understand things, rather quickly, but they may not be necessarily good at the details. And then you have people who have this very clear intelligence. And these are individuals who have a gift for being able to really get to the bottom, to really see things and tease them out in a very clear line of thinking. And then swift intelligence, people who don't need to, expend too much energy trying to get something. They have this ability to be swift, to get it swiftly. So then another one is called, penetrating intelligence or profound intelligence. These are individuals who have this aspect which really relates more to be able to kind of draw out the implications, so that one is not stuck in a particular kind of, surface level of meaning, but they're able to really, get behind and really think through the implications. So having said that, he's also saying that if we don't find support, from the brain scientist in some form of brain kind of correlates or expression, then maybe we can begin to say, well, these are all nice constructs.
So that's why very, very useful discussing. Yes.
Okay. Well, Your Holiness, I'd like to move on now and shift to another topic back to emotion, and consider the idea of emotion regulation, our capacity to regulate our emotions, and one specific aspect of it, which is a quality, for lack of a better term, I've called stickiness. And I'll say much more about what I mean by that. And a more technical term we can call recovery. So imagine a person who might have a dispute with a friend or a spouse, in the morning. And it colors their whole day. They are in a negative mood after that, and they may interact in a tense or an aggressive way with other people after that initial negative interaction. We can think of their emotions in that case as being sticky. That is, their negative emotions persist beyond the point where the original interaction occurred. They have a difficulty, we can say, in regulating their emotions, or difficulty in recovering once an afflictive conflict occurred. So we can illustrate this with two people. One of them is shown here, and another is shown there. So imagine that at the time labeled 3, some stressful event occurs, some kind of argument, and the person that's labeled A shows a much longer persistence of their response, whereas the person labeled B comes back more quickly. They're not as sticky. They are just responding in the moment and then returning.
박수 큰 힘이 주었다고.
나를 더 못 잡아야 돼.
그 나서다가 이해하지.
나를.
나서 봐야 돼.
So the other individual is still clinging on to something.
Yes. And it's our view that a lot of human suffering is caused by stickiness.
True.
And so if we can better understand the brain systems that are associated with this, and then look to see what kinds of contemplative interventions might affect this, we may be able to help decrease this kind of suffering. So this is the brain picture. On the top is the amygdala. We've talked about this before, and the areas that are shaded in red and yellow represent the amygdala. This is a slice in the brain that we call a coronal slice that goes, it just, if I were to slice just in front of my ears and open it up, that's what we would see. Now, it turns out that we can measure the recovery of the activation that we can record in the amygdala. Some people show the activation persisting for a longer period of time. Other people recover more quickly. And so the question is, for the people that show a long response, how do they differ from the people that show a shorter response? That's the first question. And it turns out that the people who show a longer response are people who are more anxious. They report that they worry more, they have more tension in their body, they're more disturbed. And we can look at that if you look at the diagram at the bottom left. The individuals who are in the red are the more anxious people. The individuals in the blue are the less anxious people, and they recover more quickly. So we can ask what the impact of different contemplative practices are on this kind of response. And what we see is that this is an experiment where we had practitioners, and this was a group that included practitioners in both the Theravadan tradition as well as in the Vajrayana tradition. They had a day where they practiced for 8 hours a simple mindfulness practice, mindfulness of breathing, and a day where they did either compassion or loving kindness. And so they practiced in our laboratory for 8 hours, and then we measured them after they engaged in this day of practice. And what we found is that particularly after the day of compassion practice, the participants show a decrease in this signal in the amygdala. they're showing decreased reactivity as well as faster recovery. And we further looked at if you look at the graph on the right, the number of lifetime hours that they engaged in meditation practice was associated with their recovery. The more hours that they practiced, the more rapid the response was. And those are the individuals that are depicted in red. Now, one of the things that we try to do as scientists is to be rigorously honest and really kind of expose all of the problems and what we say the dirty laundry of our work. And I'd like to share with you.
During wonders.
Dirty laundry is.
Right.
So the blue dots represent individuals who've never done any meditation practice before. And you can see the line in the middle is the mean, and each of those dots represents where the individual lies in terms of his or her ability to recover in this way. And what we see is that in normal people who have had no contemplative training, there's a big range. People are different. Some people naturally recover quickly, other people take a long time to recover and they suffer more. And what we found among the meditation practitioners is that only those with the longest length of practice are showing recovery equivalent to the best of the control subjects who've never meditated before. One interpretation of this, there are many interpretations, one interpretation is that at least these are all Western practitioners. And it may be that quite a few Western practitioners are attracted to do meditation because they're very anxious to begin with. And it takes them a number of years of practice before they become settled to the extent that even a person who's never meditated before, who's just naturally very emotionally balanced is. And so
controls are also Westerners, though.
yes, they're all Westerners, yes.
That could be true because, someone needs to be more motivated to do meditation. So maybe they have a little bit of problem of unsettledness of mind, so that they're looking for something.
I think that's true.
Of course, roughly speaking, generally speaking, many Buddhist centers, Tibetan Buddhist center, there are many members. They can see.
Many members seem to be a little bit anxious and, have that kind of disturbance.
Well, this is showing up in our data. So
I think that is because of perhaps I think 60s, 70s, perhaps 80s. Then gradually, healthy mind person, more sort of intelligent, and thinking deeper way, then develop some attraction. That is something, I think, different. In 60s, many hippies, I think they disturb their mind already. So they always look around, you see some answer for their disturbed mind, isn't it? So then they met all sorts of different sort of gurus.
I think that may be an issue, yes. So I wanted to show you one other finding. This is, the next one is not from our group. This was done at a group at Harvard where this is again looking at the same structure, the amygdala. And what this is practitioners who go through just 8 weeks of mindfulness-based stress reduction. Your Holiness has heard about this before from our colleague and Mind and Life board member John Kabat-Zinn, who developed mindfulness-based stress reduction. And what they did in this study is they measured the size, the physical size of the amygdala before and after just 8 weeks of mindfulness meditation practice. And what they found is that among those practitioners who report the most beneficial effects, who show the largest reduction in stress, among those practitioners, the size of the amygdala actually gets smaller over the course of just 8 weeks.
I got the impression the amygdala is sort of the basis
Of emotion.
of different emotions,
Emotions.
both constructive and destructive. So this explanation seems to see the mental state becoming more calm, more sort of
Settled,
more settled. Then mental itself becomes smaller. So that means the practice compassion, mental still remains or reduce smaller or increase.
The wonderful questions. This is the first and only study that has reported this. So as Your Holiness said yesterday, before we really believe anything in science, we need more studies. But this is an interesting report, and the amygdala clearly is involved more in what we would think of as negative emotion than it is in wholesome, positive emotion. It's involved to some extent in both, but clearly more in negative. All of the research suggests that. So we'll see whether this holds up in the scientific literature, but it's a striking finding because it is observed after just 8 weeks of training. Now, we know that the structure of the brain can actually change very quickly. There was actually a very recent study published, which I actually mentioned in our dialogue in Delhi, a study by a very well-known group in Israel, a group of neuroscientists, where they found that after 2 hours of playing a video game that involved racing car drivers, where they had a lot of hand-eye coordination, 2 hours, they found a structural change in the brain after just 2 hours. So the brain is much more dynamic in terms of its structure than we previously thought. That I think is a fair conclusion from all of this work. Constantly changing.
So what about, since we are talking about the amygdala and its role in experience of emotion, what
For
about
example, for example, the self-centered arrogance, I, some connection with amygdala?
amygdala?
We don't know the answer to that question. Very likely the amygdala participates.
Combined with sense of concern of other and full of courage, do something. That kind of, sometimes even emotion. This is so much sort of feeling. Tears also come. So that also, I think, in the category of emotion.
Emotions.
So some connection with the amygdala?
We don't know. We don't know the answer to that.
His Holiness, we will tell you in a year, because in the longitudinal study, we record every day people talking, and then we count how much they say I, me, and how much they spontaneously say we, others. And then we want to see whether this correlates to amygdala activity in the baseline, to exactly answer this question. The hypothesis is people who say more me, I should have higher amygdala reactivity.
Children with anxiety disorders and children with autism, young children, have larger amygdala. There are now several studies showing that children who have those disorders, their amygdala is actually physically larger. So I want to now move on to another topic, which is about the body. So far today, all of us have been talking about the brain. And one of the things that we're learning is that the nervous system, we know, extends throughout the entire body. It's not just in the brain. And one of my favorite stories when I talk to lay audiences about the research on contemplative practice that I love to share actually happened during the time I met you first, Your Holiness, in 1992. You asked Francisco and I and the other scientists that were with us if we would please give a talk at the Namgyal Monastery to the young monks about the science that we were doing. And we gave the talk, but we had equipment with us to record brain activity. And so we decided that we would show them how brain activity is recorded rather than just giving a dry academic talk. And our guinea pig on that day was Francisco. And we put electrodes on Francisco's head, and we had to place the electrodes very carefully to make sure the recordings were good. And we were standing in front of Francisco, and we had many laptop computers, and in those days the laptops were much bigger, so lots of equipment. And then finally we cleared out of the way so the 200 monks who are sitting on the floor can see what we were doing. And as we cleared out of the way, everyone started laughing, just burst out laughing. And we had no idea why they were laughing. We thought they were laughing because Francisco looked very funny with the electrodes on his head. It turns out that's not what they were laughing about. They were laughing that we were interested in studying compassion by putting electrodes on the head rather than on the heart. And that was a very important lesson for us. And it took many years to really understand in more detail I think what it is they were trying to tell us. But we finally got back to the heart. And I'd like to just very briefly share with you this. This is actually an MRI image of the heart. It's something we can do in the MRI scanner. In addition to studying the brain, we can also look at other organs and look at the activity in those other organs. And when we do that, these are expert practitioners. These are experts in the Tibetan tradition. These are very long-term practitioners whose average length of practice is many, many years, about 34,000 hours of lifetime practice. All of them have done 3-year retreats. And during compassion practice, they actually show an elevation in heart rate compared to novices. It's a small increase, but it nevertheless is very consistent. But what's even more interesting is that there are certain areas of the brain that show a strong relationship between the heart and these areas of the brain that are specific to when the practitioner is engaging in compassion practice. So we would say there's coupling or increased communication between the heart and the brain during those periods. And that's what we see in red here. It's specific to the compassion practice, which is illustrated on the right-hand side. And the novices who are in blue don't show this at all. So this is something very unique to the expert practitioners and suggests that compassion is not just something that's expressed in the brain, but it's expressed in increased communication between the brain and the heart. It's something we think is very interesting and may have something to do with some of the beneficial effects that compassion practice may have on the body.
And blood pressure,
So what about blood pressure? Does it go up or down?
Blood pressure does not significantly change. We've looked at that. Now, it may be that if a person was angry, we'd see more of a decrease in blood pressure.
Decrease. Say that again.
If a person was made to be angry or upset in some way, we may see more of a decrease in blood pressure with compassion, but just in the
Luna.
baseline state.
누나 blood pressure 뇽 죽었어.
말에 지다 체도니는 롱하루 주 안 대슈고 니지 검주 보이나
알래요.
아니 blood pressure 마 니지 겐기 검배 겐기 마 차에
어떻게
그래서
그래서 누나를 blood pressure 최고 수술 걸어줘서.
His Holiness nearly misheard, thinking that you were saying that if you make someone angry, the blood pressure goes down.
Blood pressure. Those people who have high blood pressure, you see, should create more angry, more anger. Okay.
So I'm going to just skip one or two slides in the interest of time, but show you one other kind of experiment that we do where we are looking here at molecules that are important in inflammation. Inflammation is so important for many different diseases. It's important for heart disease, for asthma, for certain kinds of cancers. So if we can understand better how meditation practices may influence inflammation, that potentially could be very helpful. And we have been studying in the laboratory the impact of certain kinds of meditation on inflammation. And what we show here is a person's arm, and we make these very tiny blisters by having a vacuum slowly raise the skin over the course of about 45 minutes. It's really painless. I've had it done to myself, and it's very, it's a very benign procedure. What we then do is we place some cream. You can see the white cream around it. That cream is the active ingredient of the cream comes from chili peppers. And it causes the skin to become slightly inflamed. Slightly inflamed. And it's a, you can see in the next slide, it produces what we call a flare. You can see it better on these TV monitors. And we can actually measure the size of that flare and actually look at how quickly it heals. And it turns out that just 8 weeks of mindfulness-based stress reduction results in faster healing of the inflammation, and people who practice more show a greater reduction of molecules that cause inflammation. So this suggests again that the changes that we observe are not just in the brain, but they're also expressed in the body in ways which may be helpful to our health. Now, I want to end with just a little bit about the future and what may be possible in the future with new methods that we have available. And I'll tell you about one kind of experiment which leads us to believe that these methods may be helpful. This is an experiment not on meditation, but an experiment where we took identical twins. So these are what we call monozygotic twins. So they're genetically identical. They have the identical DNA. But if you look at each twin, they vary in how similar or different they are in how in their well-being and anxiety. One of them shows more well-being and less anxiety than the other, but they vary in how similar or different they are. And it turns out that if you look at enough pairs of identical twins, you'll find some that are very, very similar, but you also find some, even though they're genetically identical, they show differences because they have different life experiences. And if you look at their brain, this is a very complicated slide, but this is showing, it's using a imaging technique that we call diffusion tensor imaging, and it looks at the connections among different brain regions. The important point here is that the more similar the two twins are in their well-being, the more similar the connections are. The more different they are, the more different the connections are, even though they're genetically identical. So this shows that pure experience can clearly affect the brain even in two individuals who are genetically identical. And it suggests that some of these differences may arise through epigenetic mechanisms. And epigenetic mechanisms involve
epigenetics la tukal tana kunstrisha gene ya chidan neba yune ko nibadiya on chema je kejorba the tirisha epigenetics. You want to explain what epigenetics is?
Yes, so epigenetics is the regulation of our genes. So our genes can be like a volume control. They can be turned on, they can be louder or softer, turned on or off, and these are mechanisms which govern the extent to which genes are expressed. So there's new methods available. The title of this paper is The Human Brain in a Dish. And what these methods allow us to do, it sounds like science fiction, but these are very prominent scientists. This is published in a very important journal.
No. So can you explain that new technique then?
Yes, so I'm about to explain it.
Yes.
So you can take a few cells from the skin just by scraping the skin.
Yes.
And take those skin cells and you can, in a dish, convert them into a stem cell, a pluripotent stem cell. When they're in the stem cell stage, they can be converted to any other kind of cell in the body. And you can actually convert them into different kinds of neurons. And when you convert them into neurons, you can look at the gene expression in those neurons, and it turns out that the patterns that you see are different from what is seen when they're skin cells. And there is research which indicates that you can look at a group of people like a group of schizophrenics who have a psychiatric disorder, and you can do this technique and you can see that within their skin cells there's no difference, but then when they convert the skin cells to brain cells, all of a sudden you can see differences which help us understand the nature of the illness in this case. But this is a technique that we can apply to humans in other contexts. And so it is a way for us to look actually at brain cells without having to go into the brain itself, because of course we could